Everyone knows what the flu is. At least, that's what most people think. You've probably heard it your whole life. It's just the flu. Stay warm or you'll catch it. Take this, it will help. Simple, familiar, easy to understand. But what if I told you most people don't actually understand the flu at all? Not how it spreads, not how it affects your body, and definitely not the myths that quietly shape how people respond to it every year. Because the flu isn't just a seasonal inconvenience. It's one of the most misunderstood health topics in everyday life. And that misunderstanding leads to mistakes, small ones, repeated millions of times, that actually increase risk instead of reducing it. Now, here's the interesting part. Many of these beliefs don't come from bad intentions. They come from repetition, from things we've heard so often that they feel like facts. But feeling true and being true are not the same thing. So today, we're going to break that apart. Not with fear, not with exaggeration, but with understanding. Insights from experts like Peter Hotez and global health organizations such as the World Health Organization and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention help us see something clearly. The flu is not what most people think it is. And once you understand it properly, your behavior changes. Let's start with the most common belief. The flu spreads because it's cold. You've heard this before. Winter comes, people get sick, flu spreads. So the conclusion feels obvious. Cold weather must be the cause. But just like we saw in the last video, that connection is misleading because the flu is caused by a virus, not temperature. Temperature doesn't create infection. Viruses do. So why does the flu increase during colder months? Again, the answer isn't simple, but it is clear. Human behavior changes. People spend more time indoors. Airflow decreases. Crowded environments become more common. And viruses thrive in those conditions. So what looks like a seasonal cause is actually a behavioral pattern. And this is where the misunderstanding begins. Because your brain doesn't track invisible processes like viral transmission. It tracks visible patterns. Cold, sickness, easy, but incomplete. Now let's go deeper. Because understanding the flu isn't just about knowing it's caused by a virus. It's about understanding how that virus actually moves. When someone with the flu coughs, sneezes, talks, or even breathes, they release tiny droplets into the air. These droplets can carry the virus. If you're close enough, you can inhale them, or they can land on surfaces. And when you touch those surfaces and then touch your face, the virus has a pathway into your body. Simple, but powerful. And this is why organizations like the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention emphasize close contact, air quality, hygiene, not temperature. Now here's something most people don't think about. The flu doesn't make you sick immediately. There's a delay, an incubation period. The virus enters your body quietly. It begins to multiply. Your immune system starts responding, but you don't feel anything yet. Then, a day or two later, symptoms appear. Fever, fatigue, body aches. And because humans are wired to connect recent events, we link those symptoms to whatever happened just before. Maybe you went out in the cold. Maybe you drank something cold. Maybe you felt chilled. So your brain creates a story. That must be why I got sick. But the real cause happened earlier. Invisible, unnoticed. And this delay is one of the biggest reasons flu myths survive. Now let's talk about something even more interesting. Why do people often underestimate the flu? Because of the language. People say, it's just the flu. That phrase sounds harmless, but it creates a mindset that treats the flu as minor, predictable, and simple. But the reality is more complex. The flu can affect people very differently. Some recover quickly, others experience more severe symptoms, and in certain cases, it can lead to complications. But here's the key point. Understanding the flu properly is not about fear. It's about clarity. Because when you misunderstand something, you react incorrectly. And when millions of people react incorrectly in small ways, it adds up. Now let's connect this back to behavior. Think about what most people do during flu season. They focus on the wrong things. They worry about cold air. They avoid certain foods or drinks. They follow habits based on belief, not evidence. And at the same time, they ignore the things that actually matter, like spending long periods in crowded indoor spaces, poor ventilation, close contact with infected individuals. And that's where the real risk is. Why does this happen? Why do people focus on the wrong causes? The answer lies in how the brain simplifies information. Your brain prefers simple explanations. Cold equals flu. Easy to remember, easy to repeat. But real systems, like how viruses spread, are more complex. They involve multiple factors interacting over time, and complexity is harder to process. So the brain replaces it with something simpler, even if it's not accurate. And this is where your advantage begins. Because once you understand the real mechanism, you stop relying on shortcuts. You start seeing what actually matters. And that changes how you behave. Not out of fear, but out of understanding. But we're just getting started. Because the biggest flu myths aren't just about cold weather. They go deeper, into things people do every day without questioning them. And once you see them, you won't be able to ignore them. Now let's move into something even more powerful, because some of the biggest flu myths aren't just about cold weather. They're about what people think protects them, and what people think causes illness in the first place. Let's start with a common belief. If I eat well, I won't get the flu. At first, that sounds reasonable. Good nutrition supports your body. It helps your immune system function properly. But here's where the misunderstanding happens. People turn that idea into a guarantee. They believe that eating healthy makes them immune to infection. But that's not how it works. Your immune system doesn't block viruses completely. It responds to them. There's a difference. Even a healthy person can get infected if exposed to enough viral particles. What changes is how the body reacts, how quickly it responds, how severe the symptoms might be. But the virus still has to be encountered first. And this brings us back to the core idea. Exposure matters more than assumptions. Now think about how people behave. Someone might focus heavily on diet. They avoid sugar. They choose healthy foods. They feel protected. But at the same time, they spend hours in crowded indoor spaces during flu season, close contact, poor ventilation, and they don't see that as a risk because their attention is focused elsewhere. This is how myths quietly redirect behavior, not by being obviously wrong, but by being incomplete. Now let's talk about another common belief. The flu is just like a bad cold. This is one of the most widespread misunderstandings. People use the word flu casually. They say, "I think I have the flu," when in reality it might be something else entirely. Because the flu, caused by influenza viruses, is different from the common cold. Symptoms can overlap, but the underlying mechanisms and impact can vary. And when everything gets labeled as flu, clarity disappears. People underestimate real flu infections and overestimate minor illnesses. This confusion affects how seriously people take prevention and how they respond when symptoms appear. Now, here's something important. Why do these misunderstandings persist? Because of experience. If someone has had mild symptoms in the past and called it flu, they build a mental model based on that experience, and that model becomes their reference point. So when they hear information about the flu, they interpret it through that lens, even if it's not accurate. Now let's go deeper into behavior again, because understanding the flu isn't just about knowing facts. It's about recognizing patterns. Think about what happens in shared spaces, offices, public transport, schools. People are close together. Air is recycled. Time spent indoors increases. And within these environments, small interactions matter. A conversation, a shared surface, a moment of contact. Each one seems insignificant, but collectively they create pathways for transmission. Organizations like the World Health Organization and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention emphasize these pathways because they are measurable. They can be observed, studied, understood. And once you understand them, you begin to see risk differently, not as something random, but as something influenced by environment and behavior. Now here's another belief that often goes unnoticed. If I feel fine, I'm not spreading anything. This sounds logical, but it's not always accurate, because there are times when people can carry and spread viruses before symptoms fully appear. This doesn't mean everyone is constantly spreading illness, but it does mean that relying only on how you feel can be misleading. And again, this ties back to awareness. Understanding that what you can't see or feel immediately can still matter. Now let's shift perspective. Instead of asking, what causes the flu? Ask, what increases the chance of transmission? That small change in thinking makes a big difference, because now you're focusing on mechanisms, not assumptions. And when you focus on mechanisms, your decisions improve. For example, instead of worrying about stepping outside in cold air, you start thinking about how long you're in close proximity to others, whether a space has good airflow, how often you touch your face after contact with surfaces. These are practical considerations, things you can actually influence. Now here's something powerful. When you shift from myth-based thinking to mechanism-based thinking, you gain control. Because myths are passive. They tell you what to believe, but understanding gives you options. Let's go back to something we mentioned earlier. The brain prefers simple explanations, but real systems are rarely simple, and this creates a gap between perception and reality. The goal of this video and this channel is to close that gap. Now, let's explore another subtle but important idea. Why do people continue to believe flu myths, even when information is available? Because information alone isn't enough. It has to replace an existing belief, and beliefs are reinforced over time through repetition, through confirmation, through personal experience. So changing them requires more than just facts. It requires understanding the structure behind them. And once you see that structure, you start recognizing patterns everywhere, not just in health, but in how people interpret cause and effect, how they simplify complex systems, how they rely on shortcuts. And that awareness is what separates passive learning from active understanding. Because now you're not just receiving information, you're analyzing it. Now think about this. Every year flu season returns, and every year similar patterns repeat, similar beliefs, similar behaviors, similar misunderstandings. And yet, most people don't question them because they feel familiar. But familiarity is not the same as accuracy. And that's the key idea. Now we're going to move into something even more practical, because understanding is only useful if it changes how you act. In the next part, we'll break down what actually matters most during flu season, the habits that make a real difference, and the subtle mistakes people make without realizing it. Now let's make this practical, because understanding the flu is one thing, but applying that understanding in real life, that's where everything changes. So instead of focusing on myths, let's focus on what actually makes a difference. Imagine two people during flu season. The first person believes the common myths. They avoid cold air. They wear extra layers. They stay focused on temperature. But they spend hours in crowded indoor spaces. They sit close to others. They don't think about airflow. The second person understands how transmission works. They don't worry much about stepping outside in the cold. Instead, they pay attention to environments. They notice when a space feels closed. They become aware of how long they're around others. They make small adjustments, not extreme ones, just aware ones. Now ask yourself, which person is more aligned with reality, not based on belief, but based on mechanism? This is the shift from reacting to myths to responding to how things actually work. Now, here's something important. You don't need to control everything. That's not realistic. But you can influence certain factors, and those factors matter. Let's break them down. First, proximity. The closer you are to someone who is infected, the higher the chance of exposure. This isn't about fear. It's about probability. Short interactions carry less risk than prolonged close contact. Closed spaces with limited airflow allow particles to remain in the air longer. Open environments disperse them more quickly. This is why indoor settings play such a key role. Third, duration. The longer you remain in a high-risk environment, the more opportunity there is for exposure. Time matters. Even small differences add up. Now notice something. None of these factors involve temperature directly, and yet they explain patterns we see every year. Organizations like the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the World Health Organization focus on these factors because they can be observed and measured. They're not based on assumptions. They're based on how transmission works. Now let's talk about a subtle mistake many people make. They treat risk as something fixed, something you either have or don't have. But risk is dynamic. It changes depending on behavior and environment. Spending a few minutes in a crowded space is different from spending hours there. Standing near someone briefly is different from sitting next to them for a long time. These differences might seem small, but they influence outcomes. Now here's where awareness becomes powerful. Because once you see these differences, you can make better decisions without overreacting. You don't need to avoid everything. You just need to understand what matters more. And this leads to something even more important: confidence. Not false confidence based on myths, but real confidence based on understanding. Because when people rely on myths, they often swing between extremes. They either worry too much about the wrong things or ignore the right things completely. But when you understand the system, you find balance. Now let's bring this back to everyday life. Think about your routine. Where do you spend most of your time? What environments are you in? How often are you in close proximity to others? These are the questions that actually matter. Not whether the air is cold, but how your environment shapes exposure. Now here's something interesting. Once you start thinking this way, you begin to notice patterns. You see how certain environments feel different, how some spaces feel open and breathable, while others feel closed and dense. And even without measuring anything, you start making adjustments naturally. Opening a window, stepping outside for a moment, creating small changes that improve conditions. These aren't dramatic actions, but they're effective because they're aligned with how things work. Now let's talk about another common misunderstanding. People often think prevention has to be complicated, that it requires strict routines or extreme behavior. But in reality, small, consistent awareness is more powerful than occasional extreme actions. Being mindful of your surroundings regularly is more effective than reacting only when you feel worried. And this ties into something deeper: habits. Because once awareness becomes a habit, it no longer feels like effort. It becomes part of how you think. Now step back for a moment. Look at how far we've come. We started with simple beliefs about the flu, cold weather, basic assumptions, and now you're seeing a system, a structure, a way to understand what's actually happening. And that changes everything, because now you're not relying on guesswork. You're working with understanding. But there's still something we need to address, because even when people understand these ideas, they sometimes go back to old beliefs. Why? Because those beliefs are familiar, comfortable, easy, and breaking away from them requires something more than knowledge. It requires awareness of your own thinking. In the next part, we're going to go deeper into that. how your brain holds on to myths, even when you know better, and how you can actually change that. Now let's talk about something most people never think about. Even when you understand the truth about the flu, why is it so easy to go back to old beliefs? Why do myths feel so natural, even after you've seen the facts? The answer isn't lack of intelligence. It's how the human brain works. Your brain is not designed to constantly question everything. That would take too much energy. Instead, it builds shortcuts, patterns, quick explanations that help you make sense of the world. And once a pattern is formed, it becomes automatic. Think about it. Cold weather, people get sick, flu. That pattern has been repeated your entire life. You've seen it, you've heard it, you've experienced it. So your brain stores it as a rule, not a possibility, a rule. And rules feel certain, they feel stable, they feel true. But here's the problem. Your brain doesn't always check if the rule is accurate. It checks if the rule is familiar. And familiarity creates confidence, even when it's misplaced. This is why myths are so powerful. Not because they're convincing, but because they're repeated. There's something called confirmation bias. It's a simple idea. Your brain looks for evidence that supports what it already believes. So if you believe cold weather causes the flu, every time you feel sick after being cold, your brain says, "See, that proves it." But it ignores everything else. The exposure that happened earlier, the environment, the timing, because those factors are not part of the belief. And this is how myths survive, not because they're correct, but because they're reinforced. Now here's something even more interesting. The brain also simplifies timelines. It connects cause and effect based on what happens close together. So if you step outside in the cold and the next day you feel sick, your brain links those two events. But as we discussed earlier, the real cause may have happened days before. This time gap is invisible, so the brain fills it with a story, and that story becomes your belief. Now imagine this happening millions of times across different people, different environments, different situations. Over time, those individual stories combine into a shared belief, a cultural idea, something everyone knows. And once something reaches that level, it becomes very difficult to question, because questioning it feels like going against what everyone accepts. But here's the key point. Truth is not determined by repetition. It's determined by understanding. And once you understand the mechanism behind something, repetition loses its power. Now let's bring this back to you. Think about your own experiences, times when you believed something strongly, only to later realize it wasn't accurate. That moment of realization, that shift, that's what we're building here. Not just for the flu, but for how you approach information in general. Because once you recognize how beliefs are formed, you start questioning them differently. Instead of asking, "Does this feel true?" "How does this actually work?" And that question changes everything. Now let's connect this to behavior again, because understanding your thinking patterns gives you an advantage. When you feel yourself jumping to a conclusion, you can pause, you can step back, you can ask, "Is this based on evidence or assumption?" And that small pause creates space, space to think clearly, space to choose differently. Now imagine applying that consistently, not just in health, but everywhere. Decisions become more intentional, reactions become more balanced. Understanding replaces guesswork, and that's powerful. Because the biggest risk isn't just getting something wrong, it's staying wrong without realizing it. Now here's something important. Changing beliefs doesn't happen instantly. Even when you understand something logically, emotionally, the old belief might still feel right. That's normal, because beliefs are not just ideas, and replacing them requires repetition of a different kind. Not repetition of myths, but repetition of understanding. Every time you recognize the real mechanism, every time you see the pattern clearly, you weaken the old belief. And over time, The new understanding becomes your default. Now let's bring everything together. The flu is not caused by cold weather. It's caused by viruses. Transmission depends on exposure, environment, and behavior. Your brain simplifies these complex processes into simple stories, and those stories become beliefs. But once you understand the system, you're no longer limited by those stories. You can see beyond them, and that changes how you respond, not just to the flu, but to everything that follows the same pattern. Because this is bigger than one topic. This is about how you think. In the final part, we're going to tie everything together and give you a clear, powerful perspective you can carry forward. Now step back for a moment and look at what just happened. We started with something simple, a belief almost everyone has heard. The flu comes from cold weather. It felt obvious. It felt familiar. It felt true. But now you see it differently, not because someone told you to change your mind, but because you understand the system behind it. And that's the difference. Because information can be ignored, but understanding stays. You now know that the flu isn't about temperature. It's about transmission, exposure, environment, behavior. You understand that viruses move through people, through air, through contact, not through cold air itself. And once you see that, the entire picture changes. Think about how this affects your decisions, not in a dramatic way, but in small, consistent ways. You stop worrying about the wrong things. You stop focusing on temperature alone. You start noticing environments. You think about duration. And those small shifts, they matter. Because real change doesn't come from extreme actions. It comes from accurate understanding applied consistently. Now here's something even more important. This wasn't just about the flu. It was about how easily the brain builds beliefs, how quickly it connects patterns, how strongly it holds on to familiar ideas. And once you recognize that, you begin to see it everywhere, not just in health, but in fitness, in nutrition, in everyday advice people give without questioning. Statements like, eating sugar directly causes disease, cold drinks make you sick, certain habits always lead to specific outcomes. Some of these ideas contain partial truth, but they're often simplified, reduced, turned into rules that don't fully reflect reality. And when people follow those simplified rules, they sometimes miss what actually matters. That's why this matters, not just for this topic, but for how you approach everything. Because once you move from "what have I been told" to "how does this actually work," you gain something powerful: clarity. And clarity leads to better decisions. Now think about the next time flu season comes around. The conversations you'll hear, the advice people will repeat, the patterns that will show up again. But this time, you'll see them differently. You won't automatically accept them. You won't reject them either. You'll analyze them. You'll look for the mechanism, the structure, the evidence behind the statement. And that puts you in a completely different position, because you're no longer reacting, you're understanding. And understanding creates confidence. Not the kind of confidence that ignores risk, but the kind that sees it clearly. Now here's the truth. No one can eliminate risk completely. That's not realistic. But you can reduce confusion. You can avoid unnecessary fear. You can focus on what actually matters. And that's where real control comes from. Not controlling everything around you, but understanding enough to make better choices. Now let's bring it back to something simple. A question. If something as common as the flu can be misunderstood for so long, what else might you believe that isn't entirely accurate? What other ideas have you accepted without fully questioning them? And what would change if you started looking deeper? Because this is just one example. There are many more. And that's exactly what this channel is about. Breaking down the myths your brain accepts and replacing them with understanding. Not to make things complicated, but to make them clear. So you're not just following advice. You're understanding it. And when you understand something, you don't just remember it, you apply it. Now, if this video made you think differently, even for a moment, because change doesn't begin with knowing everything. It begins with questioning something. And once you start questioning, you start seeing. So the next time you hear, "It's just the flu," pause, think, ask yourself, what's actually happening here? Because the answer is always deeper than it seems. And that's where real understanding begins. Follow Brain vs. Myths for more, because the biggest battle isn't outside. It's inside your mind, between what you've been told and what's actually true.